Okay, well, in the meantime, thank you, David, very much for your introduction. So what I wanted to talk about today is maybe just to have some reflections about the work that I've done in the past few years, and also drawing from this article which David mentioned, which was published in Nationalities Papers, which is about some recent research on non-territorial autonomy. But I also wanted to talk about the project which David mentioned, which was about non-territorial autonomy in Central and Eastern Europe, also drawing from some of the interviews that we carried out in some of the countries in Eastern Europe, which were covered by the project. So can you go to the next slide? Also, the title of my presentation is Non-Territorial Autonomy and Minority Empowerment and Disempowerment. And the reason for this is that non-territorial autonomy, or I would say NTA for short, can empower minorities, but in some cases it could potentially also disempower them. And I will explain the reasons for this a bit later. NTA is certainly important for the promotion of linguistic, cultural, and educational rights. And it can assist in resolving some of the complexities of promoting minority languages. Promoting minority languages is certainly a major challenge, particularly in cases of language revitalization, so in cases in which languages have become marginalized and have become very vulnerable. So not only you need to create the conditions for languages to be revitalized by providing language tuition, minority language education, and so on, but also the creation of opportunities to use these languages, and also the desire to use these languages. So in some cases, it's also a matter of raising the prestige of a particular language and to take a proactive role in the promotion of these languages. And another challenge is, of course, the balance, creating a balance between the preservation of multilingualism and also integration of linguistic minorities into the state through the use of the state language. You go to the next one. So in relation to so the title of the presentation was Past, Present, and Future. And clearly the idea of, the traditional idea of national cultural autonomy comes from Renner and Bauer, a publication of over a century ago. And it is sometimes treated as a historical curiosity. But I would argue that, and I'm sure you'll agree, since you're here, that a number of the principles which were included in the original theory on national cultural autonomy are still relevant today. And I think that the most important elements of the original theory are, so the idea of participation, which we have already discussed today, so the fact that minorities should have their own autonomy and agency and be independent in promoting their own cultural affairs and languages. And also the original theory recognized and emphasized very much the importance of language in interethnic relations. So the fact that linguistic inequality can often reflect social inequality, and he tried to provide a solution to this kind of issues. clearly the choice of a state language has political implications. It's not a neutral decision, and Renner called it a perennial source of strife, or a realistic and potentially lead to conflict. So it is important to find ways to manage these potential conflicts. And Ephraim Nimni also called the application of national cultural autonomy breaking free of normative straitjackets. So the fact that the over-reliance on territoriality can lead to a very rigid system and a normative straitjacket, and trying to think of solutions beyond this. So the next one. So what kind of solutions did national cultural autonomy offer, which I think are particularly important? So this idea of autonomy in managing language issues and cultural issues, an important aspect, which is something also that we researched in our project in Glasgow, was the running of educational institutions. So how minorities themselves can work on minority language education. And this means that even if there is a lingua franca, so even if there is a state language, minority languages can still be used extensively at the local level. Another important element is the participation in the affairs of the state and the empowerment of minorities, which is also linked to resources. And very often when we spoke to minority representatives in our own research, they told us resources are really essential, so funding for the promotion of minority languages. And also the importance of participation is, of course, stressed in Article 15 of the Framework Convention for the Protection of National Minorities, which talks about participation in cultural affairs, in particular those that affect the minorities themselves. So in terms of general research on NCA, clearly, the research on non-territorial autonomy, it's relatively recent, and the concept is quite fuzzy. There's some kind of conceptual mist around the non-territorial autonomy. So the studies have tried to classify different types of NTA, to highlight the main functions and to analyze case studies. What exactly makes NTA? It is part of the toolkit for the promotion of minority rights. So how can we differentiate between NTA specifically and the promotion of minority rights more generally? And it has been suggested that part of it is the institutionalization of channels for cooperation between the state and minority institutions. Then there are, of course, disagreements as to the real benefits of NTA, and some people have also highlighted the shortcomings. The fact that sometimes there are quite limited guarantees that are given to NTA institutions, that they can entrench the divisions within society just because they often imply a form of identification which is exclusionary, so you're part of an ethnic community or you're not. So it can lead to a form of antagonism. But then I would also argue that the emphasis on co-decision making, so on cooperation between different actors within a state, can also lead to better shared working solutions. And also there is the argument that non-territorial autonomy is preferred to territorial autonomy because it's less threatening. So it implies flexible solutions which will not lead to territorial claims or even secession. Because of security concerns, in some cases, NTA is preferred to territorial autonomy. So a number of studies have looked at the kind of possible benefits, effectiveness of NTA, to what extent it is effective, and so on. And then other studies have also looked at researching how NTA is perceived in different societies. So trying to analyze NTA as it is, not the way it should be or what it should do, but what it can tell us about societies that have decided to embrace NTA systems. And then I just wanted to mention a few outcomes of our project, which David already mentioned, which is this project on national minority rights, and we carried out research on non-territorial autonomy in different countries in Eastern Europe. The countries were Russia, Hungary, Serbia, and Estonia, and I did most of the research on Russia. And what came out of this study was that there were different motivations in the adoption of an NTA law. So all the countries that I mentioned had adopted legislation on non-territorial autonomy. And not only there were different motivations, which we can discuss later if you're interested, but there were very different ways of implementing it. So clearly, NTA has to adjust to local conditions, to historical legacies which exist in the countries in question, and they are, of course, very much dependent on the political system that exists in a particular country and the political elite at that particular time. But in the interviews that we had, it was clear that language and education were very important to our respondents, and they have clearly identified a link between language and identity. So NTA for languages were an essential aspect of the implementation of NTA legislation. There were clearly different opportunities which were offered by the system. And in Hungary and Serbia, minority institutions were also able to run their own educational institutions. In Russia and Estonia, they had fewer opportunities, and in Russia, for example, the NTA institutions were involved in developing textbooks and other educational activities, but mostly it was the teaching of minority languages outside the regular education system, so for example, Sunday schools and so on. They all faced difficult circumstances. So in all the countries that we worked on, there was a tendency towards linguistic assimilation, which is very common. And for example, in Russia, there has been a movement towards the promotion of the state language. And in Estonia, also following the end of the Soviet Union, a promotion of the Estonian language, and also a very strong, there has been a very strong minority language in the use of Russian, which has further marginalized the minority languages. So those languages which are spoken besides Estonian and Russian. But in all cases, there had been some benefits linked to NTA systems. So in some cases, it was more a symbolic type of recognition. But if this was also useful, this was also very much appreciated, considered important by our respondents. And we can also say that the types of NTA mechanisms that were closer to the original model, the one promoted by Renner and Bauer, were also the most viable and gave better results. So, for example, the running of educational institutions, the running of schools was particularly useful, and those systems which provided steady and guaranteed funding were the ones that were also more viable. And then paradoxically, we found that territory is important for NTA. So territory is important for non-territorial autonomy because it was those minorities that lived compactly and had a kin state which tended to get more benefits from NTA. And just a few considerations. Is it how much time? Yeah. Okay. Concerning the present and the future, for our respondents, even the symbolic aspect of NTA, so the symbolic recognition by a state was important. So NTA is often considered ambitious and sometimes even fanciful, but it also offers pragmatic solutions. So at the local level, some of our respondents were able to work out some solutions to work with public officials, and also combining, for example, in the case of Russia, and also in other countries, combining territorial autonomy and non-territorial autonomy to create a hybrid system. So the two systems can be interlocking and work in tandem. In some cases, cultural activities can be the exclusive emphasis on cultural activities can be a factor of disempowerment. For example, in the case of Russia, in which minority institutions are supposed to stay out of politics, it kind of became a straitjacket by which minority institutions could only work on cultural activities, and in this case, disempowering. There are also new opportunities which are offered by transnational NTA. So, for example, the SAMI in Scandinavia, and some have suggested that there can be some transnational activities, and a form of transnational NTA for the Kurds in the Middle East and for Roma. There are evolving systems, for example, the one in Canada, this idea of institutional completeness, so the idea that linguistic communities outside Quebec should be able to access all services in French, so institutional completeness in this sense, and the fact that these linguistic rights have been increasingly promoted through the jurisprudence. At the same time, litigation can also take some rights away from NTA institutions, as it has been the case in Serbia, where a very far-reaching law was adopted, but then some of the same rights which had been given were eroded through litigation. Just to mention some complexities and challenges, and then I'll stop there. NTA is sometimes criticized for what we can call groupism, so the assumption that the group has an internal homogeneity, and we can make assumptions about what the community wants. It's important to remember the internal diversity of minority communities, and it is extremely difficult to represent their interests the interest of all the different actors within our minority communities. Some of these rights, some of the rights of NTA can be manipulated, can be instrumentalized by the so-called ethnic entrepreneurs, is something that we sometimes found in our research as well. And it's important to make sure that there is a link of accountability between the leaders of minority communities and the community more general. And also, there can be instances of forced participation by which it looks like there is a dialogue between the state authorities and minority communities, but in fact there is very little dialogue and shared decision making. And these are very difficult situations by which a state will make decisions on the institutional framework for NTA and also co-opt some of the leaders of these organizations. And then, just to conclude, there are some aspects of NTI which are still very relevant. I think the issue of participation and seeing minorities as actors and not making assumption of what minority communities want. The NTA has been used in many ways. There have been many manifestations of NTA. We need to be aware of the complexities of NTAs, so the fact that they can be instrumentalized, and the fact that it's actually very difficult to establish what the collective will is for an entire community, and there are issues of internal democracy. But I think what is very interesting about NTA is that it is still evolving, so it's not just a concept which can be relegated to the past, but it is evolving, and there is probably still some untapped potential. So there are still some potentialities which can be realized. The importance of funding is clear. So resources in order to really empower minorities. And I guess the challenge is for NTA systems to be flexible enough to accommodate different situations, but at the same time having some specific guarantees, having solid guarantees. And I think NTA is also important in the modern context. So the fact that we live at a time of globalization, but also regionalism and localism, and the challenge posed by right-wing populism means that we need to find solutions that go beyond the nation state. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Federica. It was a lecture that was extremely comprehensive, but also very concise, and thank you. You've left us at least 10 minutes for questions, but maybe with your permission, Ivan, we could take 5 minutes of the coffee break because we were late beginning. So I'll open the floor to questions. We could maybe take a round of 3. Could you please identify yourself, and I think if you put on the desk microphone and keep it close to the mouth, we should be able to hear you at the front. Thanks. Questions, please.
I was interested to hear more about your fieldwork in Russia, especially Kazan and Tatarstan, and the role of the Muslim minority, or the Tatarstan minority, how it works in, for example, in Kazan and Tatarstan. How does it work with the protection of the language and cultural minority, or is it more in kind of total strong integration in society? Thank you.
Yeah.
Can I take another question, please?
So, hi, thank you for that. My name From the University of Eastern Finland. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how regime type or illiberal liberal regime types, how this impacted the sort of state of affairs that minority groups are encountering in the first place in these different contexts that you looked at, as well as the types of motives and opportunities and successes that were encountered through these NTA mechanisms. And then sort of as another perhaps smaller question, I'm always intrigued by the terms ethno-business and what its potential ethical implications are. For example, if we are to call it as such in our research, because as we know, sometimes this can be used by members in another camp to discredit minority rights claims, for example, saying, see, they're really only in it for themselves and not for the interest of the group, and this hurts minority rights initiatives as a whole. So thank you very much.
Should I answer? Yeah. Okay, thank you for the questions. They're both quite complicated questions and very wide-ranging. But so about, to answer the question on Russia first, yes, I did field work in 4 ethnic republics, including Tatarstan, and also in some kind of multi-ethnic cities in Moscow and St. Petersburg. Russia is a hybrid system by which territorial autonomy is combined with non-territorial autonomy. So within the ethnic regions, the legislation, mostly the rights of minorities are regulated by the Russian Constitution, which provides some rights for the republic itself at the regional level. So non-territorial autonomy is mostly used outside the ethnic republics to create minority institutions which will promote, for example, in the case of Tatarstan, to promote the Tatar language outside Tatarstan. Because the population of Tatarstan is about half Tatar, half Russian, the minorities have, the Tatar population have more rights within the ethnic republic itself. Said that, and is also linked to the second question about regime types. There has been recently a movement towards centralization, political centralization in Russia, and increasing promotion of the state language, and also what they call the creation of a unified education space, which has affected in a negative way the opportunities for republics to make decisions on the teaching of their own languages. So until recently, it was possible for the schools in Tatarstan to include Tatar language in the curriculum for all the schools in the Republic. And since 2018, this is not possible. It can only be optional. So you can see there's definitely an erosion of the rights and the autonomy which once existed. And then going back to the question of regime types, yeah, I mean there are major differences in different countries, and in more authoritarian regimes or semi-authoritarian, it is much harder for minority institutions to participate in decision making. So the structure will be more top-down rather than bottom-up. And there can be some cases such as those that I referred to as false participation, by which it looks like there is a dialogue between the different actors, but in fact some of the systems are instrumentalized through the cooptation of some individuals. And I can say that some of the people we spoke to were very actually resilient and resourceful, because they still found ways to interact with the local authorities in innovative ways, and to try to have a dialogue. But this varies very much from situation to situation, and clearly, even at the local level, there can be different opportunities. And even they told us we worked very well with this public official, but then the person left, and we had to start again with a different public official, and it was much harder. So it really varies a lot. In terms of ethno-business, yeah, I think you're right. It can be problematic as an expression. I think all we can do is define it clearly. I mean, you can make the decision of using a different expression, but if you do use it, just define it clearly. And I think we have to be honest about it, because there are situations in which some leaders or minority community might, in fact, instrumentalize the system for their own personal benefit. We can't deny it. So this could discredit the entire minority rights system, but I think we have to recognize that it is a problem, and just to remind the general public that these are isolated instances, and they're not the norm.
Can we take one or two more questions, please?
Hello, my name is Entan. I'm from University. Thank you, Federica, for sharing with us your research and your results. I was researching this field of administrative autonomy. Actually, my PhD thesis addressed this field, and I reflected on territorial autonomy and non-territorial autonomy. And my question to you is how we can balance the national interest and the minority rights based on your experience, based on your research, because it's a thin limit between the national interest and the minority rights. The region in which we are now is a model in this field. We have here a lot of minorities, and we all are living in harmony, and there were no problem in this field. Because I found some models in Europe, for example, the Ireland autonomy, yes, and Marcus Uxi wrote a lot on this field, and also we can find a lot of, for example, in Corsica and other territories in which the autonomy is balanced between a large scale of autonomy, in which we can find some territorial autonomy, yes, next week non-territorial autonomy, next week several rights given to the minorities, the right to use their own language, the right to use their own language in education, and so on and so on. So how we can balance this? Because the words that are problems in this field.
Yeah, well, it's the $1 million question, and I think, yeah, of course, it is very difficult, and it will depend on the case, and I hesitate to say this particular model is very good, because what works in one country might not work in a different country. I think also what our research showed is how important the historical legacies are. So when we did research on Russia and Estonia, some of the historical legacies and some of the forms of repression which some minorities experienced they really cast a very long shadow, and they had an impact on the different policies that can be developed and what can work or not. I think, again, maybe what I can say, which will not answer your question very well, but is that in creating this balance, it's important to involve all the different actors and to listen to all the different voices. So to try not to have a kind of a stultified system of participation by which decisions are centralized and maybe there is an involvement of just 2 or 3 actors, but to try to consider the internal pluralism of a state and the internal pluralism of the different communities. So to really have a dialogue about how to create this balance, how to have such an equilibrium.
To establish from the start some limits.
What do you mean by limits?
To establish exactly what are the limits of negotiation between a minority and the majority.
Yeah, but also I think that one of the points which is made in the opinions of the, like, well, if I think about some of the opinions of the advisory committee on the Framework Convention for the Protection of National Minorities, is also that these systems have to be revised. So, I mean, I spoke about the past and how the past can influence the present, but also the political circumstances are evolving all the time. So, and, you know, the inequalities between different linguistic communities and social inequalities also change. So so yeah, establishing some limits and frameworks, but also making them flexible, because clearly, so I guess I haven't answered your question at all, but maybe some reflections on that.
Time for one more question, please.
Hello to all. Zerrin Savaşan, Selçuk University, Konya, Türkiye. My question is about the political representation and the role of the minorities in decision-making procedures. If it is possible, I can direct my question to Varol Ahmet as well, if it will not be so difficult on the basis of the specific case of Muslim Tatars in Romania. Thank you.
So,
So my question,
Yeah.
of course,
Yes,
is
yes,
keynote
yes, yeah.
speaker, but I can also direct the question to Varol Ahmet as well.
so the question to me is
Political representation
yeah.
in your specific case, in your project, what the results about their political representation in the governments, in the system, and their role in the decision-making procedures, particularly regarding the issues regarding them, related to them.
Okay, that's another very broad question. In terms of political representation, I mean, in relation to Russia, for example, there isn't a very developed system for political representation. I think it's the case in many countries that when we researched NTA, NTA can have NTA institutions can have a say in decision making, but it tends to be more of an advisory model. For example, we can say in Russia there isn't a specific system of political representation. Political parties on the basis of ethnicity are actually banned. So you couldn't have a Tatar party. For example, there are some MPs, of course, at the regional level and at the state level, who represent minorities, but it's not something which has been systematized. So I would say in most cases it's more like an advisory function, and this is what we studied in our project, to what extent this advisory role could have a role. Advisory role could have an impact, and it depends on the situation. I wouldn't say that it's a very clear form of guaranteed political representation.
Thank you, Federica.
I don't know if you want to say something about it.
No, we'll just wait for the
Yeah,
response.
okay, because I can't remember for the presentation.
I'm up for the talk about that.
Okay, yeah.
While we are waiting for the response, perhaps if you can very briefly give us a few more details about these concerns of the Canadian and Serbian case, because you mentioned that
no, in the
rather specific in that list of specifics. So, you mentioned litigation and also the Canadian case. Could you please clarify what exactly seems to be the challenge there?
Yeah. Well, I'm not really an expert on the Canadian case, but what I read is that the litigation jurisprudence has actually had a positive role in the Canadian case in recognizing the linguistic rights of French speakers outside Quebec. So the litigation has actually had a positive impact in this case. In the Serbian case, the opposite, because the law on national councils, which was adopted in 2009, I think, actually gave some extensive rights to national councils, but autonomy was contested after the law was adopted, and some provisions which were contained in the law were actually challenged in the Constitutional Court, which meant that the law became diluted and less effective. But I think Katinka will speak about that more specifically in one of the sessions. Okay, that's good. That was the short version, and she can tell you the details.
La întrebarea adresată de domnișoara din Turcia, mă bucur că s-a gândit la această întrebare și mă bucur că am reușit să o cunosc cu prilejul acestei conferințe. Deci a întrebat cum se descurcă tătarii din Dobrogea cu autoritățile teritoriale. Tătarii sunt bine integrați în Dobrogea, au reprezentați în administrații locale și centrale. Noi suntem organizați sub Uniunea Democrată a Tătarilor Turco-Musulmani din România. Avem membri cu studii superioare, medici, profesori, ingineri. Deci, în general, ne descurcăm foarte bine aici, în Dobrogea. Suntem la noi acasă. Mulțumesc pentru întrebare.
With your permission, I will translate. Thank you for your question. We, the Tatars, are well integrated with representatives in both local and central government. Within the Democratic Union of the Muslim Turkish Tatars in Romania, we have members with higher education, medical doctors, teachers, engineers. We have very educated people. We do very well, and we feel at home here. Thank you.